a good exercise if you're kind of sitting here listening like, well, I want to do this, but I'm not sure where to start. Essentially what we did was we got a handful of the guys together, and as the base kind of beginning place, we kind of sat around a table one day and we're just like, what do we like? What can we target? And we weren't looking at the actual interest in Facebook. We were literally just around the table with like our laptop and writing this down on a Google Doc. And there was things from yoga and music festival. There was also things like poetry and college football, which we were like, I feel like people that like us might watch college football, right? And not all of them worked. But what's great about this is that if you have a little bit of budget, you can test them all at like $5 a day. So don't be precious about what audiences you're showing your stuff to. Do be aware of the cost per result. But if you think, hey, poetry could be good, right? I thought that it was mediocre. It wasn't very good. Spent $10 on it, turned it off. Like, okay, it's not performing well. So it's a good exercise to write a bunch of things down, then go in and see what's targetable, and then test those things.
You are now listening to the Creative Juice podcast, brought to you by Indepreneur.io.
What's up, Indies? Welcome back to the Creative Juice podcast. This is episode 212. I'm your host, Jack McCarthy. With me, as always, is your awesome co-host, Mr. Ed Isola. Ed, what is going on? What's new in your world, my friend? And what are we going to be talking about today?
I am super pumped. I'm having a good week. Just kind of working on Indepreneur and 502 stuff as always. Feels like a lot of good stuff's rolling. And today we're going to be diving into how as an artist you can, one, figure out what interests your fans like outside of music, and two, how you can use that to target them and make your ads more effective.
Yeah, I think that this is going to be a really interesting topic that we've kind of touched on before, and it'll be fun to dive into it because we've had some experiences at IndieX, at the agency, working with creatives that aren't necessarily just artists. We've got some YouTubers on board. We've got some comedians on board. We've done some really cool work with variety shows and things that kind of are outside of the scope of what a normal artist who might just target, for example, in their advertising, fans of other artists that sound like them. And as targeting options on platforms like Facebook get broader, and, platforms like TikTok, for example, and Google aren't necessarily making their targeting options any more granular, we're getting into a place where targeting options are going to become more broad as advertising platforms just have more data kind of aggregated on people. We're going to be losing some of those more granular, laser targeted options that I think a lot of people are used to seeing, not only in music, but in any industry that you might be running advertising for. And you need to get really kind of creative about thinking high level and then bringing that down to the more granular level when it gets to talking about your content. So I think this will be really fun to dig into and just give you guys some context and some ideas to run with. Let's start off just kind of right out the gate here, Ed. When it comes to digging into the things that your fans dig, where would you start when it comes to something like that? I know we've done some experimenting with the 502s, but there's also been plenty of clients that we've worked with at the agency where targeting the comedian that they have common fans with isn't necessarily an option for us. Or they might be, I know we've worked with like a variety show, for example, that's been on tour, which has been really, really cool. And in that case, we weren't necessarily targeting similar artists in the same way that we would for like top of funnel. Where would you start? What would you recommend? And what are you kind of seeing?
Well, it's cool because we are rebooting the Fan Finder training, which I think is public knowledge. And we're putting some of this in there too. And it's kind of like over the last 3 or 4 years, you look at where the suggestion started, which was like the artist targeting worksheet, which was literally like list, your 12 or 13 similar artists and then build out from there. It was all artist centric. And it's cool because now for myself, for people at IndieX, for people in Indie Pro that we consult with, it's not as important. Like Jack said, thinking about it high level as opposed to like, I sound like this artist, therefore people will like me. That's still a good approach, but it's actually proving to be almost less effective sometimes than going high level. So the thought being, okay, where would you start if you're trying to target things that are not artist centric? For me, the starting point is always like genre or something comparable to genre. So we're a folk band. So you go on there, you can find folk music or Americana music or something in that lane, right? Like rock and roll or rock, rap music. Those things all exist in all these different platforms. And it's something that's so broad and so high level that if that ever goes, it will be the last thing to go. They're more likely to cut out Mumford & Sons as a targeting interest before they cut out folk music as a whole. So that's kind of one thing to start with as like an artist is like, okay, well, what are they talking about? Where can I look? It's like, well, pick your genre. That's a good first one. And if you're not a musician, like Jack was kind of alluding to, we've had some really interesting success stories lately working with some comedians where instead of targeting similar comedians, we actually tried that and all these people were targetable, but like going after Kevin Hart or whatever, it was less effective than just targeting comedy in the area. So that was a great example of this high level genre-esque type thing working really well. That's probably like, step number one is look towards your genre at the highest possible level as a targeting interest.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. And for creatives that are outside of the music space or kind of adjacent to the music space, I think this is particularly important because some of your interest targeting options may not have been there from the start. We've gotten plenty of people over the years who have asked why isn't Billie Eilish targetable, for example? I think I probably brought that up on the show before, but the same could be said for filmmakers or comedians, like you said. The same could be said for actors and actresses. Like there's a lot of creative adjacent spaces that may not have had those targeting options ever that music was kind of fortunate enough to have. So I agree with you, like starting to think like high level interest for what your fans might be into. And I wanted to say like folk music or genres in general, that's an interesting one to mention because like you said, they're probably like the last ones to be removed, so to speak, if kind of more and more of these interest options keep getting picked off. But they're also the first ones to be added. At least that's kind of what we're seeing in like the TikTok ad space. Initially, when TikTok ads, when the platform was just starting to get developed, a lot of what you could target was just like music, period. And it was pretty bad. But now, over the past few months, especially, like we've been seeing more and more interest pop up on there. So you're starting to see genres. And not only that, why it's important to think in this framework is also because when you can do things like hashtag targeting on TikTok or genre targeting or interest targeting on Google, you can search for specifically hashtag punk rock on TikTok or hashtag folk on TikTok and look for that kind of stuff. And you can use, if there are trends in that genre, you can search for trending type topics in there. Same thing on YouTube or in Google ads. First off, very high level, for example, you might go after audiences that are interested in country music, but then at the placement level, you might be able to think a little bit more broadly speaking about like, okay, what kind of channels and what kind of videos fall under this broad category of country music or folk music or rock music. And you don't have to necessarily think just about artists. You can go after publications, you can go after magazines, you can go after TV stations, so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I think something interesting there that you just hit on was like, you said, where would I start? And I said genres, but you had a really important point there where it was like, music as a whole is a targetable interest on most platforms. So you don't want to go so high level that like you're not parsing people out at all. We're like targeting just music on Facebook, for example. Just music is going to be way too big, right? So that's just something important where if you're moving away from the specific artists, we're not jumping all the way up to just anybody that likes music. There's like this nice middle ground that's proven to be really effective from a targeting standpoint. So I think that was one point I just wanted to kind of highlight that you just made. The other thing too is I think that filmmakers, which you kind of mentioned, I think that's a really good exercise for musicians specifically to kind of think through that. And I think that that's helped me relate it back to like, okay, well, I've done this for comedians or so-and-so. How do I apply that to myself? And so I think just walking through like filmmakers as an example, I would guess that Steven Spielberg or whoever is not going to be one like, if they're targetable, they're probably not going to be super populated in terms of audience size. I would just guess. So then that kind of leads to the question with, okay, that rules out similar artists, right? You start to think about what's adjacent to that. Maybe you can target specific films. That might be too small. Maybe that's where you start targeting Netflix or something like that, where it's this big platform.
Or even like franchises like the Marvel franchise or the DC franchise.
Yeah, that's a great thought. Like, it's helpful to kind of do this process for things that are outside of yourself sometimes. And you can start to think, oh, so filmmakers, I'm going to target Netflix, Marvel, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, those kind of things. Maybe there's a filmmaking interest where now all of a sudden you have 5 different interests, which can probably be 5 ad sets. And they're not really related to filmmaking, but they are also very related to filmmaking. That's kind of the angle that we're trying to get at here for you guys. It's like there's a world outside of those 10 similar artists. And the benefit to thinking this way is that typically you're going to have much bigger audiences, which means you'll probably have more people to reach, a longer lifespan for your ads. And the point to be aware of on that is like, it also means you need to know your creative better and know who you're talking to so you can call them out in your copy and your video content. But it really opens up a lot of doors in terms of longevity and people.
Yeah, that's totally true. I know we were doing some experimentation with you guys when we were initially starting on IG Reels and doing some testing on that back in like the late summer, early fall last year when we were getting into testing, festival type interests. And even getting into things like yoga, which were interests that you knew from over the years of growing your fan base that those people were interested in. You kind of had built customer avatars of your fans, knowing these are what our people are into, and we can get that information on them from looking at their buying habits with us, seeing what they talk about when they come to shows. I want to touch on that in a second here. But what that kind of teaches us is like, it allows you to think a little bit more horizontally in terms of scale than you might if you were just going after fans of artists or fans of bands as your targeting option. And, take the filmmaker example, for instance, like in the same way that you might go after films or filmmakers or studios or franchises, you also might go after, filmmaking tools because you know that those people hang out in those spaces. So anyway, it kind of takes it to that next level of like, what else can I categorize my fans to be into? This goes back into some of the stuff that we've talked about. We talked about on the episode with Shay when it came up to building a topic wheel. What is it that you are interested in? And what is it that your fans are interested in? And where is that overlap?
Yeah, dude, I think the comment on like a horizontal point of view is really, really great because for the last 3 or 4 or 5 months, whatever we've been doing for the 502s, we've been running a Reels campaign at a pretty high spend, and it's not fatiguing. It's not going up in cost per click. It's just staying where it is at like $150, give or take a day, whatever we're running it at. And it's because we don't have an ad set that's running more than like $10 or $12 a day. It's not like we're running $100 a day on one audience. It's all these little things like you mentioned where it's like yoga, music festivals, whatever, folk music. That's a really cool thing because it allows you scale to kind of grow and continue to run things. And that comes back to that longevity point. I think that one thing I kind of wanted to highlight there is you were just talking about like we were early on testing yoga and music festivals. And anyone that's familiar with the 502s, the thought might be, of course, those things would be close to your brand, right? But those weren't things that we were thinking about originally. And it stemmed from the fact that our genre and artist targeting were fatiguing because we were spending so much. And it was fatiguing quickly, especially on like Reels. So a good exercise, this is the point of my comment, a good exercise if you're kind of sitting here listening like, well, I want to do this, but I'm not sure where to start. Essentially what we did was we got a handful of the guys together, and as the base kind of beginning place, we kind of sat around a table one day and we're just like, what do we like? What can we target? And we weren't looking at the actual interest in Facebook. We were literally just around the table with like our laptop and writing this down on a Google Doc. And there was things from yoga and music festival. There was also things like poetry and college football, which we were like, I feel like people that like us might watch college football, right? And not all of them worked. But what's great about this is that if you have a little bit of budget, you can test them all at like $5 a day. So don't be precious about what audiences you're showing your stuff to. Do be aware of the cost per result. But if you think, hey, poetry could be good, right? I thought that it was mediocre. It wasn't very good. Spent $10 on it, turned it off. Like, okay, it's not performing well. So it's a good exercise to write a bunch of things down, then go in and see what's targetable, and then test those things and just kind of let the results speak for themselves.
Yeah, and kind of taking that a step further too, like you were saying, like you guys were asking yourselves questions like, who are we? What do we like? What are the things that we're into? What our fans might be into? When kind of starting to think about building what we call customer avatars, which is really just a profile of who your fans might be. You can even give them like a cute name, And what you can do is you can ask yourself things like, how old are they? Where do they live? Where do they shop? What kind of clothing brands do they like? What TV shows are they into? What kind of activities do they do? And does that stuff overlap with you guys or your band or your art or your music, whatever it might be? Does it overlap with what you're putting out into the world creatively? And if it does, then, there might be a case to try. I'm not here to say that you should wipe out artist interest targeting altogether, by no means. However, we're getting into a place where newer artists aren't being added into these platforms, and a lot of things are still being taken away. Just last week, Facebook wiped out a whole bunch of targeting options around religion. And so for a lot of, for example, Christian artists, which we work with a few at the agency, a lot of their interest targeting options are now totally wiped out because we thought, it's just going to take away some of the broad sort of church-related stuff or specific religion-related stuff. But no, public figures were gone, artists were gone, television shows were gone, publications were gone, all of it. So that's just a pretty extreme example of what can happen if you're relying too heavily on one sort of targeting subset. So I thought that was worth mentioning here. But in addition to kind of brainstorming this information about your fans and making this kind of a regular practice as you evolve and you grow as an artist, because I get it, like a lot of the stuff that we're talking about here is more advanced sort of thinking when it comes to how to target and how to think about your fans. And if you're just starting out, that might be really overwhelming because maybe you're saying like, I don't have any fans. But as things start to accumulate, as fans start to accumulate, and maybe even as you start to play out, you'll learn about your fans. You'll learn about them in person. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago. Ed, can you touch on any of that, like your experiences while out on the road and kind of how hearing the things that you guys said and had your fans say to you just in conversation, how has that influenced your targeting and your marketing message overall?
It starts to tie into, you can have conversations with people, and I think we maybe mentioned this last week. It creates this feedback loop where you're having this conversation and it's like, multiple people have now mentioned that they like listening to our music when they go to the beach. It's like, we like the beach. Maybe we should target the beach as an interest and see, like, do these people, you know what I mean? Like that kind of thing where it's like, it would be a weird thing in my head to be like, hey, we should show our folk song to people that like the beach, because that doesn't immediately translate. But then you start to kind of, like you're saying, you get out into the shows, you get out in the real world, you're talking to your fans and your supporters, and you realize like, everybody's mentioning this, right? Or there's a lot of sentiment around wanting to travel. So now you can start targeting travel. If you're paying attention, it gives you insight into the hobbies that your supporters like. And like Jack said, you hear those hobbies, you pick out what you like, you can just run ads to it and test it. And like I said, maybe it's good, maybe it's not. But by having conversations with people, it kind of gives you insight. And to touch on Jack's point too, like if you're like, well, I don't know if I don't have fans, and actually to touch on two of the points Jack made. One is like, this is in no way, first and foremost, a call to like stop targeting similar artists or anything like that. This is in addition to, is how I view it. You can have your similar artist ad set, and then you can have your beach ad set, and then you can have your poetry ad set. And like you're having multiple ad sets. That speaks to that horizontal kind of spread. But if you're kind of sitting there, it's easy enough to fill out that fan finder worksheet and say, here's my list of similar artists, let me target them. If you're kind of thinking, like Jack said, hey, I don't know, I don't have a supporter, I don't know. It's really easy to find like a single supporter, even if that supporter is your sibling or your friend or whatever, somebody that really likes your music, and then just create interest based off of them and say, they like this and they like this other thing. Let me try to target that and see. Like you can pick a single identity to kind of get the ball rolling, so to speak, if you're at a loss of like, where should I start? Because this is advanced thinking, and it's also super logical if you kind of get out of the weeds and step back and you just think about like, what are my friends that like my music like? That's a good place to kind of start, I think. And that's been helpful to me early on.
Well said. Yeah, I totally agree. And I think just to circle back real quick, we started to kind of touch on this definition, but just to give a strict definition of the concept of horizontal scale and vertical scale. When we talk about scaling, especially like when you're advertising. Scaling is the concept of spending more money on advertising. And when you scale, ideally what you're trying to do is you're trying to reach more people in order to get a desired result. So, at the very top of the funnel, it might be trying to reach more people to expose them to your music, to get introduced en masse. And then as we go further and further deeper into the buddy system, we're talking about things like growing your list and getting more sales. When we talk about vertical scale, we're talking about the idea of adding budget to an existing group of audiences. So on Facebook, that would be, adding budget to an ad set slowly over time. On Google, it would be, or TikTok, it would be adding budget to an ad group over time, or trying to scale one campaign that's targeting one group of people. When we're talking about horizontal scale, rather than just scaling up budget in one place, like Ed said, you're spreading it across. So you might add, 5 totally new, different, well-differentiated audiences in this way that we're kind of talking about. And that's where you get your audience scale from. What we've been talking about a lot here hasn't necessarily been about budget scaling. We've just been thinking about like human scaling, how to reach new kinds of people that might be interested in what you do that you might not have been able to reach before. So that's kind of like the very, very high level of what we're talking about. And then the definition of horizontal versus vertical scale. But I want to touch on also, in addition to like, when it comes to testing this stuff, what you should be looking for, right? Let's say you're running an IG Reels sort of placement campaign or a fan finder video view campaign on Facebook newsfeed. Really, when you're doing this kind of testing, your cost per views, they can be deceiving. I've certainly seen this before, and maybe you can corroborate here, Ed. But I've certainly seen before where when you're going after a larger audience, which a lot of times these broad audiences do have, they're big, bulky, multi-million person audiences, a lot of times you will see your cost per view or your cost per result, whatever your optimized result is going to be. You might see it be lower than usual and think to yourself like, oh, that means this is really working. However, like this is where it's really, really important to be paying attention to the qualitative sort of engagement that you're getting as well, to see, are these people who are watching this video actually engaged with it? Am I getting a lot of comments? Am I getting reactions? Am I getting shares? Are messages coming into the page? Are these fans or are these people that are just passing by and watching a thing? I think that that's really important to note here because it's easy to get stuck in the trap of like, well, it seems like it's working, but it's not actually, generating you any kind of longer term result, or the campaign's not going to work as an asset for you long term to drive any real value into your music business. So I wanted to mention that just as a caveat and sort of a word of caution.
Yeah, it's this holistic approach. And I think that's also a shift from Fan Finder 1, the training, where it was mentioned, but it was very much like, look at the cost per view, and that's kind of going to be your determining factor. And I think that's really smart because now you're looking at a video view, cost per view objective on a video view campaign. But if you're running a Reels campaign, a lot of times we're running that for clicks. So now you're looking at cost per click. So cost per video view, depending on your campaign, isn't necessarily as important or the only kind of important factor. I think that you can sense when something's going well. And I think that should not be discredited. Like if you're running an ad and all of a sudden you're like, I feel like I'm getting more followers, or I feel like I'm getting more comments, and I feel like I'm just getting more engagement in general. I feel like as an artist, that's something that I've been able to pick up on. It's been like, I feel like things are going good right now. Let's keep doing it. I think that if you ever feel that way, you should stop and you should let it kind of keep going and don't overthink the cost per view or the cost per click. Like ultimately the end goal is engagement, and cost per view and cost per click are just one of the factors to kind of help you gauge that. But if you're running, this is just an example, if you're running a Reels campaign and you're getting, a cost per click of 15 cents, but you're not getting any new followers, or you're running the same campaign, but now you're getting 30 cents per click, but you're getting followers for 50, 60, 70 cents or $1 even, the higher click is better because more people are engaging. So just kind of think about that. Like I treat that as my own thing. Like don't overthink it. If it feels like it's going well, it's probably going well. Let it continue to go. Feel free to try to optimize it, but don't always be searching for the next best thing. Like one of the best things that I've done for myself as part of the 502s is stick with things that are working. It works. We just like triple down on it and let it keep running and keep growing fans. And I think that's a super important kind of takeaway from what I've done that hopefully if you're listening, you can kind of like find something that's working and then just let it run?
I think that that's a really good point, and it kind of drives home the idea that I think when you've got a gut feeling that something's working and you're starting to see that qualitative engagement come in, I think that's all the more reason to dig into your data and look and see like, okay, what's really happening here? Like, why is this happening the way that it is? Then you're kind of backing up your gut a little bit with something that's real. And that's a great thing to be able to do. So yeah, I totally agree. I think that's really, really important. This kind of leads us to talk about the idea of like, in any of this, you're letting your content really do the targeting for you. When you're going after these broad audiences, and this kind of pushes on the idea that like being a content first creative right now is so important, and putting out the right video and the right messaging is really what's going to do a lot of the work for you, because the people who, you know, are in those big audiences that you're targeting that aren't into what you would do, your content is going to be the thing that disqualifies them, and you know, they'll just keep on scrolling by. And for the people that will end up being fans in that large pool, if you're putting together content that's really killer and draws those people in, that's going to be the thing that does the bulk of the targeting for you and really brings in the right kind of people. The people that you'd always hoped that you could laser target. Here in 2022, the thing that is doing the laser targeting is not, you know, the click of a button in an ads platform. It's the actual creative work that you're doing that's in front of them. That's like a creative person's dream, in my opinion. It's not magic button pushing. It's hard work and creativity. Like, that's amazing. That's like a really cool place to be in. And I think artists are uniquely positioned to do very well with that if they want to.
Yeah, it's like, how many viral videos have you seen of like cool performance clips on Reels or TikTok or wherever? That is powerful in itself. Like, the content speaks for itself. And then if you can put this kind of advertising power behind it, that it's like, it's a huge advantage. That if you ever talk to somebody and they're like, I'm just going to post a lot and hope I go viral, it's like, cool, maybe that will work, maybe it won't. If you can find a piece of content that like captures that, and it doesn't have to go viral organically, but it just captures that essence of like, this is really cool, you can post it and then you can run ads to it, and like, you're now making yourself go viral, and nobody knows that except for you. A lot of times what happens if you have that beautiful combination going on is that things then do tend to pick up some virality on their own organically. I mean, I think this is probably like the 19th episode in a row where we in some way, shape, or form mentioned like, really good content is really important. And this is just another example where if you're gonna go dip your toe into advertising a folk song to fans of college football, it's adjacent enough that it will work, but it's also like, you got to have great content to make that work. So I think that's important. And then like, the other thing again is like the consistency, where if you find something, you're better off spending $10 a day for the year versus like one huge burst of spend, because you're consistently getting fans and you're consistently finding new people into your ecosystem. And I think that's really, really important as well.
I think another thing, and you're right, like 2022 has been a big podcast arc of content related discussions. I'll link back to episode 205, where we specifically really leaned in on this idea of being a content first creative and how to stay ahead of the creative curve and what that means right now. Because I think so much of what we are talking about here today was also covered in that episode, probably in a bit more depth when it came to actually creating content. But outside of content, here's another way to just learn about what your fans are really into and how you can capitalize on that is like, just ask them. I know this sounds like a crazy concept, like surveying your fans, and we've definitely talked about this on the show before, but the idea of like surveying your list or surveying your fans on social is such a powerful opportunity to learn about them and learn about the things that they like. And then, you know, you can use that in things like targeting, but also you can use that in your copy. You can use the responses to dig into your fans' tribal language and then talk with them that way. It shows up in your email copy. It shows up in your ad copy. It shows up on your websites and your landing pages. And a lot of that, I think, is often overlooked. You know, one of the questions that I love to ask in like merch surveys, for example, is like, if you could dream up one piece of merch that we would drop, what would it be? Like, tell me everything about it. And the responses that you get from these kind of questions are not scarce. they come in droves. Fans want to let you in on their world just as much as they want to be in on yours. And I think when surveying your fans, that's a really good opportunity to do it, because it's like, you're most often, at least when I'm usually asking, putting together a fan survey and sending it out, it usually is like, hey, I need your help with something, or I want your feedback. This is where you can really learn about your fans and your biggest fans, the ones that are closest to you, your customer list, your subscriber list. That's where you can really, really get into the weeds.
Yeah. And the other thing too is cool about surveys is like, you can do a full survey and send that out. You can also do a really informal survey that's literally like, you could post on your Instagram feed, like drop your favorite summertime activity in the comments. Like that's a survey also. So there's different forms of survey. One is probably more natural to you than the other. And like thinking about certain artists at IndieX, they probably would do both, right? Like the email list would probably want a full survey, and the socials would just be like, let me drop a comment. And then the point of the surveys is it's really helpful to get it, to read it. If you do something like a full survey, like Jack's saying, you probably want to record those somewhere and put those into your process. But it's also just really good, like he said, to read through these things and get an understanding for how people talk, how people think, what they like, and just kind of absorb that and let that be part of like your brand voice. It's really great. So the last thing I'm kind of thinking about that might be worth touching on is just like pulling ideas for targeting directly from your content. And I think that that's something, circling back to the beginning of this episode, where we were talking about a variety show we work with and comedians, and like, the variety show specifically, this campaign we were running was specifically holiday oriented, and we were targeting like broad, like Christmas, as an interest, and like Santa Claus as an interest. And these are things that's their content, right? They're a variety show centered around the holidays. And so we could have gone and targeted like Bing Crosby or whatever. But instead of doing that, we just were like, let's go really broad, and like anybody that likes Christmas will like this. And it worked really well. So you can sometimes pull inspiration, just as like a last thought on my end, from what's in the actual creative you're going to be promoting and running ads to.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And to touch on what you mentioned about social surveys, not that I'm encouraging anyone to follow this trend of posting, but by now I feel like most people have seen on Facebook and probably on Instagram, and I think they kind of go off on Twitter too, the trend that's been going on over the past number of months. That's like, tag your favorite X and see if they'll reply. And it's usually like tag your favorite artist or tag your favorite band, tag your favorite rock band, whatever it might be, and see if they'll reply. And you're getting tons of random people dropping things that they like on these posts. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily like solid engagement bait, because like, if you're going and asking your fans or asking strangers, tag your favorite artists, like that's not really doing much for you. But think about what you could do if you took that a step further and you said like you said, Ed, like, what's your favorite summer activity? Like, drop it in the comments. You can even gamify that sort of thing and incentivize people. Like, we're going to pick our favorite and like write a song about it on our next live stream or something like that. You can get fun with that kind of stuff. And I think that that's a really good way to drive one, interaction on social, and get people just feeling like, oh, these people are fun to interact with. And it's not all serious business. We're constantly talking about their own music or their art, but it also does wonders for helping you figure out what they're into and how you can spin that into copy, how you can spin that into offers, and potentially even spin that into targeting.
Yeah, dude, agreed. I think that, pending any other final thoughts from you, I think it could be kind of a cool thing for us to leave this episode with like an open-ended question that maybe we can answer ourselves at the start of the next episode, namely like a thinking activity for anybody listening centered around what you were talking about earlier, where the religious targeting interests have been removed. And so that's like completely wiping out any kind of targeting for religious stuff. So my thought is that if you're listening and you're kind of like trying to grasp, okay, how do I think about this? Like I said, it's a great exercise to think about something that's not you. And so this religious thing would be a great way to kind of maybe, take a first stab at it, where it's like, you can't target anything religious now. What kind of interests and values and that kind of stuff can I maybe try to target if I was doing marketing for that thing? So could be cool to like leave that as an open question for y'all, and then we can talk about it next week real quick at the beginning of the episode and just drop our thoughts.
I love that. Let's do it. It's a good challenge.
Challenge accepted.
Yeah. Well, we'll leave you with that, Indies, and we will catch you next week on Creative Juice. We're going to be having a special guest on. Really looking forward to it. So we'll see you guys next time. Get into what your fans are into, and hopefully you guys take these insights and use them to find out more about your fans. Peace out, Indies.
Can y'all really feel us? East Coast, feel us, West Coast, feel me.